What's up everyone, I'm Eldritch, and it is once again time that we look at the Camelot Unchained class reveal that happened last Friday. As always, I will be going over these classes and tie them into mythology and folklore, and then I speculate about what they might do in the game and what abilities they might have beyond the ones that we've been shown. Now I have to admit, when I first saw this release I was a little bit disappointed, because this one is not as crazy as some of the others that have come before. But I have realized that the releases of the last couple of weeks were so crazy that they just completely overshadowed this one. This one isn't bad at all, it's just not as extravagant and over the top as the other ones. But let's get them out in the open. The community decided and the chosen letter was C, which turned out to be the mages. Yes, the mages, and at first glance they do look a little bit more boring than say the shapeshifters or the scouts. But that's just because we've seen mages before. And I do think as far as mages go, these are actually pretty cool. So I've personally changed my mind about them a little bit, but what do you think about them? Let me know below in the comments. Today we'll start with the Vikings, and the Viking mage is the Water Weaver. When I first saw the Water Weaver on Friday, my first instinct was to think that he was styled after Njord, him being the god of seafaring and generally being a little bit more well known. But as it turns out, CSE surprised even me and went instead with the 9 daughters of Aegir and Ran. The 9 daughters of Aegir are all about water and the ocean. They're actually all named poetically in a way to describe the ocean. They are Hrun, the welling wave, Drup, the foam fleck, Himingleiva, that through which one can see the heavens, which references the water surface, Duva, or the pitching one, Bloduhalta, bloody hair, which describes Red Sea foam, Hövring, the riser, Ud, the frothing wave, Bilgja, billow, and Kulga, the cool wave. Some sources also claim that the 9 daughters of Aegir were also the 9 mothers of Heimdall. Heimdall has 9 mothers at the same time. They all sort of birthed him together, and I don't mean that in a figurative way. I mean, it's mythology after all, sometimes it gets a bit weird and abstract. But there are other sources saying that Heimdall's 9 mothers were actually giantesses and had nothing to do with the 9 daughters of Aegir. But personally, I prefer it to be the 9 daughters of Aegir because I think it makes it a cooler story with him being born of the sea. In Camelot Unchained, they decided to style the class's runes after the daughters. Hrun's favor and Kulga's favor are already known, and we might get up to 7 more of them, which would actually be really cool. And because of their poetic meanings, they could all have cool different effects that sort of match those. Now, from all of the abilities that we've seen, the Water Weaver actually seems to be a little bit more of a support mage, using their magic to weaken and control instead of dealing pure damage. And I will say that I've seen a little bit of a wave of discontent, pun intended, amongst the Viking players on the forums, because they kind of expected more all-out attack classes to match the all-out attack classes that they already have. In my opinion, however, that is not feasible at all. Even if your realm is styled around all-out attack, you still need support classes. You still need healers. And you might even still want defensive classes. Because you're not always going to be in a situation where you can just attack. Sometimes you're going to have to defend, and if you have to defend with just all-out attack glass cannon characters, then that's probably gonna turn out horribly for you. And so I personally think having a mage that focuses a lot on debuffing and controlling, and also presents an inherent synergy with the Mjolnir, i.e. making things wet and then zapping them with the lightning for the extra roasty goodness, is a really good thing that's gonna serve the Viking realm well. And let's face it, not everyone on the Viking realm is gonna want to play an all-out attack character. If that was the case, we'd just need 3 or 4 different kinds of berserkers and just fashion them in different styles, and that'd be good enough. Now let's talk about the Tuatha Dé Danann mage, the Druid. Now I can already hear people protest. Druids aren't mages? Are you crazy? Actually, and let me just push my glasses up my nose. Historically speaking, we know absolutely nothing about Druids. And the reason for that is that they did not leave their own accounts. All the sources that wrote about Druids were enemies of the Celts. And so they had a vested interest in making them look either bad or making them look like savages. Which is why none of the accounts that have been left about the Druids are believable in any way. I mean, one of them was written by Julius Caesar, for bloomin' sake. And that man was absolutely not a reliable source on anything regarding Celts or the Gauls specifically. The only thing that every single source says is that the Druids were a higher caste in the Celtic society. But whether they were just learned men or soothsayers or leaders or clergy or members of the judicial system, in the end it may have even been a mixture of all of these things. But regardless of that, any modern interpretation of what a druid is really just that, an interpretation. And as such, this interpretation of a druid is no more correct or false than the more broadly accepted and used Healy nature wizard that can shift into animal forms. I'm not even entirely sure who came up with that specific trope, but it's probably a mixture of Tolkien and Gygax. And seeing how this game is more about the actual mythology background, there's absolutely no reason to assume that it should be a nature wizard or a healer or a shapeshifter. In Camelot Unchained, the druid uses so-called void magic, cancelling out reality one bit at a time since 2001. Sadly, so far we've only been presented with one rune example of a rather basic rune that does void damage and increases a target's panic rating. But they did throw 3 shapes at us, and I have to say I love all of these shapes. A slow-moving, tracking bolt that ignores gravity and hits things along the way, an expanding bubble that interacts with friendly projectiles, outward expanding PBAOE that targets an ally. Now those are some cool shapes. Every single one of them sounds amazing. And in general, the class sounds very much inclined toward AoE, which, as everyone who's played Dark Age of Camelot or Warhammer Online knows, can be both good and really bad. It all really depends on the implementation and the balancing. But I definitely like the direction of the druid and think it makes a great mage for the Tuatha De Danann. And now lastly we come to the Arthurian mage, the Flame Warden. And I have to be entirely honest, I could not for the life of me find anything about this. And the only sort of wizard-like character in the Arthurian tales is of course Merlin. And let's face it, everyone knows about him. I mean, he has inspired so much folklore and fantasy writing, there's even a TV show dedicated to him. So instead of me repeating what most of you probably already know, and not really having anything to talk about with the Flame Warden or the internal flame that it mentions, I'll instead talk a little bit about the proposed magic system in Camelot Unchained. Abilities and spells in Camelot Unchained do not come pre-packaged. When you play the Flame Warden, you're not going to get a Firebolt, you're going to get the Primal Fire rune and the Bolt shape, and then you have to put those together to form a Firebolt. But it doesn't stop there, because you get a whole lot of other components that you can mix and match pretty much freely. And the way this works is that abilities are constructed of 2 or more parts. You always need at least a rune and a shape, but then you can add additional effects and modifiers that will change the properties and how the spell functions, and it may increase preparation time or cooldown time in exchange for increased damage or additional effects or anything like that. Let me give you an example. Let's say you play the hypothetical future Viking mage class of the Fisticuffs Mancer. And one of the runes you get is Das Boot, which utilizes your boot and targets the enemy's face. Now one of the Fisticuffs Mancer's shapes could be the Unsafety Dance. You could then combine Das Boot and the Unsafety Dance to form the Boot Dance. And now it's on! But you don't have to stop there. You could add the modifier of Indiscriminate Justice, which will increase the cooldown time but also inflict damage on other people around the main target. And so you end up with the Boot Dance of Indiscriminate Justice. But this is only one spell of hundreds you could potentially make with the components that you have. You only have to switch out Das Boot for something else, or the Unsafety Dance for a different shape, and already you have a completely different ability. In Camelot Unchained, the Flame Warden is a mage that makes use of fire. And I know that doesn't sound too exciting because there's been a million fire mages and a million MMORPGs. But the thing about the ability system in Camelot Unchained is that you can have all sorts of runes that can make even a fire mage interesting. You could have runes for embers, magma, smoke, and ash. You could even have different runes for just fire. And with all the shapes and modifiers, even something as mundane as a fire wizard can become something really quite awesome and special. As a fire mage, expect high damage, long range, and very little defense. Even though the Arthurians are the defensive realm, they still need something that deals damage. Every realm needs a damage dealer. It's a similar situation to the Viking mage. Having an entire realm where everyone is focused on defense, it's really gonna be quite difficult to ever win with them when you're on the attack. Just like when you have an entire realm based on attack, it's gonna be really difficult to ever defend anything. Now I will say that I'm personally not a huge fan of the Circle of Power. Those kind of effects tend to force a certain rather boring and stationary playstyle, and it also has a good chance of either crippling the mage, turning him into a turret, or making him absurdly OP. And I would really like the Flame Warden to not become another Bright Wizard if possible. As I said in the beginning, initially I was a little disappointed with these classes. But the more I've been thinking about it, the more I think that these are actually going to do fine. One of the complaints that I've seen the most about them is that they only have one element each, and that there's really no choice in what you can pick, which means that if you're an Arthurian and you want to play a mage, there is only fire. That is your only choice. And I can absolutely understand where they come from. I do think that it may be better to have 2 elements per mage, just so that there's a little bit more choice. I do understand that that would just add a lot more work, but the thing is, only having 1 magic type per realm is very limiting. In the end though, I still think these mages are pretty damn solid and worthy of Camelot Unchained. They're just not as batshit insane as the shapeshifters or the scouts. And now let's come to the weekly scoring. Last week I gave 1 point to every single realm because I thought the scouts were just so amazing. This week we're going back to just 1 point for the best class of the trio. And while I do think they can make the Flame Warden the most interesting fire mage there is, it's still a fire mage, and I am not all that interested in fire mages. So for me the choice is absolutely between the Druid and the Water Weaver. And out of those two, I do think that the Druid is just a little bit more interesting, because it's not only a Void Mage, which is a magic type I find incredibly cool, but it is also a complete departure from the very tired trope of naturey, healy, wizardy, druid shapeshifter guy. So that is 4 points for the Tuatha De Danann, taking a massive lead on the other 2 realms, at least in my book. Your mileage may of course vary, and I would really like to know what you think the best class in this trio is. Let me know below in the comments. Alright, and that is it for today. I really hope you're enjoying this series, and if you are, please consider liking and subscribing, and if you have any feedback, leave it in the comments. Next week, I would really like to know what H is. Seriously guys, please vote for H. H is going to be amazing. I really want to see H. Vote for H. Do it. Please vote for H. But until then, I've been the CloakingDonkey, and I'll see you in another video.